I went home to an intervention from my parents and from some friends who had seen me get changed for a party, and my ribs were showing through my back. The feeling of control is actually just a feeling of safety that we're seeking outside of us. And hello everybody, welcome back to the Lucy Superfox show. My name is Lucy Superfox and this is my podcast. So you are on my sofa in my comfies with my 3 dogs here with me, although they are wandering around, so who knows what they decide to do. Because one, it's festive season and getting into my comfies and being on the sofa was definitely the vibe. But 2, I think that sometimes when I'm in the studio and maybe when I'm up in my office, sometimes I don't allow myself to share the vulnerability of the things on my heart and share the depth of my stories that I know that when I work with clients resonate and land with them. So here we are, the next few episodes from my sofa with my little furry ones. I have 3 dogs, if you didn't actually know. I have, you can see little Jasper featured. He's a little terrier. And then I have 2 crazy Frenchies who have just taken themselves off. So without further ado, this week's episode is all about how I stopped binge and emotional eating. This is a huge topic at the end, this time of year. We're all struggling with more triggers than ever. Having food in front of us, attending social events. And I think what can sometimes happen is the behaviors that we mask and hide the other 330 days of the year are brought into the open. And that can be really triggering for us. So in this week's episode, I want to share with you how I stopped emotional eating, how I stopped binge eating, and how you can too. So without further ado, let's dive in. So I struggled with emotional eating from a really young age. I remember being maybe 12 or 13, coming back from high school, and I wouldn't eat much at school. And then I would come home and I would basically gorge myself on food. And this was something that both me and my sister did, but for some reason I thought was totally normal. And it was only really when I was then in the social environments of other people, when you hang out at other people's houses, that I realized this wasn't the case. And at the time, looking back at that time now, I realized that actually the reason was probably because we were bored. So maybe it wasn't so disordered as it was about something to do and something to provide comfort for us. Both my parents worked. My mum worked as a teacher and she would get home about 5, and my dad worked from home but in his cabin, so he would pick us up from school, or when we were old enough we'd get ourselves home from school, and then we would kind of look after ourselves until mum came home. And even when my younger brother was born, and we did have we had a wonderful nanny, her name was Kate, who kind of took care of my brother and was around for us. Even then, I think these habits and behaviors were so ingrained in us that we didn't really know how to break them. But really, when it turned into the binging disorder, I think is actually when I started my fitness journey. So I found the gym around the age of 14. I would go after school, I'd go at weekends, and especially when I started working, I would do it in and around my kind of job. And I found myself doing crazy things like buying 4 chocolate bars and eating them all before going to the gym and then not eating dinner. And this kind of pattern started, and looking back now, I can recognize that it was so much more than just thinking that was what you did or it was normal. It was actually so much about how I felt and creating a feeling of control. I really, really battled with a feeling of being out of control. And now as a trauma-informed mindset coach, I can look back and see that feeling was actually a feeling of being unsafe. And we often say, I'm a control freak, or, I need to control things, or I like to control my diet. And actually, the feeling of control is actually just a feeling of safety that we're seeking outside of us. And so I was seeking that in food and in my control around exercise. And this continued and got progressively worse, because what also happened with my disordered eating was that I ate less and less and less and less and less. So then when I did have the occasional binge, it wasn't necessarily impacting me on any caloric level. And I ended up being very, very, very thin. So I went to university a year late. And in that year at university, I went home for Christmas. And most people go home and they're bigger because they've been partying hard and put on the pounds. And I didn't. I went home to an intervention from my parents and from some friends who had seen me get changed for a party, and my ribs were showing through my back, and they were just genuinely concerned for my health and well-being. And at that point, my parents asked me what they could do, what it was about, and I honestly really thought at the time it was about body confidence and pure body confidence. And as I look back, it was, but I wasn't confident in my body, not because I didn't have a good body, but because I wasn't confident in myself. And it was something that was socially acceptable. It was something that at my age at 19, that was just what you did. You cared about how you looked around you and went, oh yes, people care about how they look, look at magazine covers. And so I really felt that the reason it was it was like an outside thing. It was body confidence. I needed to fix my body confidence, and that was actually the decision I made at that point to get a breast augmentation, so to have breast implants for the first time. And I say the first time, there's a story for another day on that. And so that was when I got my first breast augmentation. I was 20, and do you know what? It did make a massive difference, but it didn't change my relationship with food. Food still was then something that continued to control my life, whether it was in a deficit, so I was controlling how little I ate, or whether I was secret binging, secret eating. I mean, the standard one that I remember would be, driving home to the shops, and whether it was drinking or sinking a bottle of rosé, or eating my way through, 5 bags of crisps and 8 chocolate bars, or a whole tray of cakes. It didn't really matter what it was. I was always seeking something on the outside of myself through food. And if I'm totally honest, I didn't really shift this behavior with food until I was almost 30. And I actually remember my last binge. It was an entire carrot cake, one of those Tesco Finest ones. And I was gluten-free at this time, so I did stick to my gluten-free. It just became gluten-free binges. But I remember it. It was November. Well, I'm 37 tomorrow at the time of recording this. So it was like just over 7 years ago. And I remember that last binge. And I remember being like, what the fuck even happened? Like going into the trance that you go into, coming out of it being like, what the actual fuck? And I then knew that was my last binge. And that sounds so weird to say, but I think there was a part of me that did that kind of had that last binge because it was what I normally did. But I had done so much work on myself and was so channeled and focused into what I was creating with my business and career. And I will talk about this in future episodes. So I want to make really clear that I didn't necessarily purely heal from binge eating and then everything else in my life was fantastic. I was able to recover from emotional and binge eating because of a few things, which we're going to talk about in a sec. So I came out of that last binge and I kind of knew that I was done, and I knew that I no longer needed food to make me feel safe. I no longer needed food to allow me to feel in control. I no longer needed to regulate my calories in order to feel some sense of my life. And looking back at that, I think as much as I knew some of that in the moment, as Steve Jobs says, you can't join the dots going forwards, only back. I look back now and realize what a pivotal time in my life that was. What a pivotal moment that last binge was. So I definitely built then a relationship, kind of a dependency relationship with alcohol, especially in the lockdown year. I personally found it very hard to switch off my business. I hadn't really learned the sense of like the depth of boundaries and creating that sense of like work and then play or work and then rest. And I know a lot of us really struggled with this time. But the number one thing, again, I was seeking was safety. I was seeking some kind of normality, some kind of sameness. And so that glass of wine a night or a couple of vodkas or a couple of gins was the way of what I thought was regulating my nervous system. I didn't call it that, but it's a thing that helps me relax or switch off is what I would say. And the truth is now I know what I was doing. I was seeking something to help my nervous system move out of this fight or flight mode and into this element of relaxation. But when we use something like food, so high sugary foods, high fatty foods, alcohol, scrolling your phone, it doesn't really matter what it is. When we use anything outside of us to create that sense of safety inside of us, we're not actually creating safety, we're actually creating numbness. So we go into a state of our parasympathetic nervous system called dorsal vagal, which is actually shut down and switch off and numbness, not connection and joy and abundance and safety. And so I think there's a misillusion that we often, believe it's creating one thing when actually it's creating another. But here's the thing, there is always a payoff. This is why I don't believe in self-sabotage. There is always, always, always a payoff. And that payoff is usually unconscious. It's usually something we're not aware of, but it is usually meeting some kind of need, whether it's to feel safe, to feel heard, to feel valued, or normally just to get an escape from the noises in your head, the thoughts in your head, the sense of anxiety in your gut. We use these things outside of us to create a feeling inside of us. Now, I look back and I can trace it all the way back to being a young kid and being what I call a highly sensitive person. I was a highly sensitive child, likely with a very dysregulated nervous system, very young. My dad had a very, very dysregulated nervous system. My dad has neurodiversity, and likelihood his handling of parenting was maybe a little erratic, and the nature of my parents did for work and the way that they had a full social life with music, the likelihood is I felt some sense of detachment from my parents, and that created a lack of safety in my nervous system. And I reached for what is most commonly accepted, and that was food, or then the control of food, or then alcohol, or then business, right? I've definitely used business as a self-soothing too. I've used the amount of money I've earned. I've used the views on my social media. Trust me, I've had them all. And the answer to all of them, whether it is binge and emotional eating, alcohol, overspending, it doesn't actually matter. The answer to all of them is about doing the inner stuff so that we're not looking outside of ourselves for something out there. Now, the challenge is if your nervous system is fried, if you are constantly in fight or flight, if you are seeking these things to create that calm and safety inside of yourself, then I'm going to use the big word, there is likely trauma present. Now, we've got this massive stigma around the word trauma, like it's something that happens to someone, like it's a one-time thing, like, oh, I haven't got any trauma because I wasn't in a big car accident, or I haven't got any trauma because I wasn't abused. Like, trauma is so much more than that, so much nuance, so much depth. And trauma is simply the safety our nervous system felt when we experienced an event or our daily life. That's all trauma means. It means a lack of safety in the nervous system. So the truth is we all have trauma, whether it's something that was chronic and ongoing, like parents who argued a lot or parents who had no money and we felt that stress, or whether it was a big time event. Maybe it was the loss of somebody important to us. Trauma shows up so much beyond our memory. It shows up in that nervous system, in that sense of anxiety, in that sense of frustration, in those inner thoughts in our head that we're not good enough. And it shows up because it needs to be heard. So what we do instead, because we don't know how to heal it, we're not taught how to feel it, and we're certainly not taught how to deal with it, we seek kind of release instead. We seek that in food or alcohol, or like I have in business and relationships and money and sex and television and scrolling your phone and all the things, right? All the things. So the answer then to stopping emotional eating and stopping binge eating and stopping that relationship with food has nothing to do with the food. Now, sure, some practical elements here. If you wanted to stop drinking, you wouldn't go out in a pub every night. If you want to stop eating shit, maybe you want to stop putting yourself in an environment where there's shit food. So there's some practical things, like you want to make sure you're managing your blood sugar, because when I get hangry, I'm going to eat what's in front of me, right? That's just chemical. The same thing with alcohol. If I'm going to be put in a social environment every single night where there's wine in front of me, it's going to be very difficult for me to say no. And you guys know, and I talk about this at massive and great length, you know, your subconscious mind is like 90 to 95% of the show. That's your programming. That's who you've been. That's your past identity. That's how things used to be. So if you want to create something new, you've only got that 5%, my dog's snoring, he's so cute. You've only got 5 to 10% of your conscious mind or willpower to create that change. So it's not because you're useless or you just self-sabotage or there's something wrong with you. It's simply because you've got 95% fighting 10%. And I say this all the time, but I'm saying it again. If you have got a nervous system that 90% of it is programmed, living in fear, living in fight or flight, living in anxiety, living in terror, living in the past, because that's simply all our nervous system is an imprint of every single belief, every single thought, every single behavior, every single thought we've had up to this point, then you've got 95% fighting 10%. So the answer then is not manipulating the 10%, controlling everything we eat in the hope that we never eat shit again or never drink again, right? And although there is, you know, a space for ascesis or abstinence, sure, the answer to creating what most of us are seeking, which is, I'm going to say it with inverted commas, balance or a regulated sense of being able to have a slice of cake and it not mean we eat the whole cake, is creating safety in the nervous system. And this is why recently I made a resource specifically for transformation coaches and their clients. So if you are on a transformation journey with your body and you find yourself self-sabotaging and procrastinating, then this resource is for you. If you are a transformation coach that works with clients on weight loss, on weight gain, on changing their body in some way, in prep, in photo shoot prep, then I made this guide specifically for you. And you can get that by going to lucysuperfox.com/shop. And what I break down in this 45-minute deep masterclass with slides, with a full workbook for you to work through, is how trauma could be impacting your transformation. Now, as I've already given you an overview, it's going to be creating that sense of dysregulation in the body that's helping you reach for things on the outside. But what I want you to know is that whether you are self-sabotaging, procrastinating, or falling into your binge trance like I used to do, there is a version of you that is looking for safety in the action, is looking for soothing in the action, is meeting a need in that action. You are not doing it because there's something wrong with you. You are not doing it because you are broken. You are doing it because what makes you feel safe. So when we create safety inside of ourselves through doing the inner work, through doing our inner healing, through being willing to look at our habits, behaviors, and patterns, be willing to, work with someone like myself, work through one of my programs or something similar, that is when we're able to heal our relationship with things outside of ourselves, when we heal our relationship with things inside of ourselves. So If you are ready to grab yourself that trauma and transformation workbook and masterclass, you can get that by going to lucysuperfox.com/shop. And a sneak preview and exciting news for you, just for podcasters and people who are on my email list, is that the Freedom Masterclass is coming back live on the 1st of January 2025. So you can join me live at 8 p.m. on New Year's Day, where I'm going to be breaking through how to break the cycle of who you have been to step into your next level self in 2025. I'm going to be diving deep into food, diving deep into money, into relationships and love. And I'm going to be talking about how we break the cycle of who we've been to become that next level version of us. So if you want to join me live or with the replay, plus with 2 free meditations that come with this free masterclass, you can get that by going to lucysuperfox.com/freedom to register for your place to join me live or grab the replay. So that was how I personally stopped and moved out of the space of binge and emotional eating. I hope this episode resonated and landed, and stay tuned for more episodes on how I broke the cycle of being myself. Thank you so much for joining me, as always, and I'll see you on the next episode.